Welcome to When Playtime is Over. Our goal is to stimulate thought and conversation, not to convert your perspective. Any persuasion is solely at your discretion and deliberation. For your consideration, we would like to offer George Floyd, Part 3 of 3, Deductive Conclusions and Forfeited Integrity. And as always, for those who are easily offended, emotions will not be needed. So please, before entering, check your feelings at the door. An uncompromising evaluation. An objective examination has to be detached from a desired outcome or emotional inclination and should only examine the facts and actions as they were observed to have occurred. Then compared to any explanation given when evaluated against those observations will yield the clearest determination of guilt or innocence. Strictly an uncompromising assessment of the deeds alone removed from the identity of the person performing the deeds will objectively reveal if the deed was justified, regardless of who the doer of the deed may have been. For the exact purposes of guilt or justification of actions, it is practically irrelevant who committed the act, but only if they had a legal right to do so in the manner in which they did. It comes down to right or wrong, proper or improper, no matter who did it, friend or foe. Impartiality demands that if that same set of circumstances existed with you, it would be considered fair and just. This is the ultimate perspective of neutrality of judgment required with respect to the application of the law. With this lens of detachment, the incident can begin to be clarified. The encounter was initiated by the clerk requesting a police response in connection with Mr. Floyd passing a counterfeit $20 bill. The police responded to find Mr. Floyd was located in the driver's seat of his vehicle. He was removed from the vehicle, placed in cuffs, and escorted to the sidewalk where he was seated. He was then escorted across the street without incident, but resisted being placed in the rear of the squad car. A recognized mental disorder of anxiety, but no exclusion from being placed in a squad car or arrested. A brief struggle of control ensued, with Mr. Floyd being resistant to being placed in the rear of the squad car, but not actively combative or aggressive toward the policeman. Being placed on the ground prone is a judgment call and at the policeman's discretion, but would seem to contradict any claims of their concern for his previously displayed distress. There was oddly no verbal attempt to de-escalate the situation or comment of his anxiety, especially since it was not a violent crime or exigent circumstances. If possible, de-escalation is the first tactic on the force continuum scale and would have seemed preferable considering the investigation into the details of the counterfeit 20 had not begun in earnest and they still had not determined what their course of action could or would be. Enforcement of the law dictates that restraint be used comparative to the crime committed unless escalating circumstances commands a more intensive response. Just as you would not use SWAT for a jaywalker, the response given has to be in accordance with the crime committed and the response received. That notwithstanding, once prone on the ground, Mr. Floyd's mental state was also reflected by his physical state. He was submitted. He was within the policeman's control and physically compliant. He was also verbally compliant, pleading for his life and stating his physical condition of respiratory distress that he could not breathe. Mr. Floyd offered no further resistance to being placed in his car because he was prone on the ground and not aggressive, combative, or evasive at all. He was secured. But was he in custody? Had he been advised that he was under arrest? Chauvin demonstrated his total control of Mr. Floyd by virtue of Chauvin's hands being in his pocket, indicating that whatever resistance that had been present, Mr. Floyd was well under control at that point. Furthermore, Mr. Floyd provided no resistance from the point of being unconscious or deceased, although Chauvin continued the neck pressure with his hands casually in his pockets. Suspect control or threat of harm was never a concern. Chauvin's casual placement of his hands in his pocket from the start reveals that any threat had been subdued. Mr. Floyd was never able to account for the bad money transaction where a fake $20 bill turned into a homicide. Before dying, Mr. Floyd had to pass out first meaning he was still alive but unconscious. Chauvin's continued pressure, in addition to rendering Mr. Floyd unconscious, he ensured that he had no chance at survival or revival. No corpus delicti or proof of guilt was ever established, since the intent was not established that he knew it was bad money. It should be noted that if Mr. Floyd had been 100% compliant, the incident would have unfolded differently. However, did his noncompliance rise to the level of force that was used and sustained on him? Cooperation with law enforcement is always preferable, but force used for noncompliance must be measured to the circumstances. It should also be noted that so callous was Chauvin's indifference that even Mr. Floyd's plea for his deceased mother or his unconscious state elicited no compassion from Chauvin's demented implementation of the law. Now let us examine the policeman's actions individually and collectively to establish any culpability. No culpability means that they had no effect on his death, and it probably would have happened anyway at that exact particular moment. They did not send 4 policemen for a counterfeit 20 assignment, so who received the call and who were assisting? Was radio notified that they were assisting, and should they have even been there? If Chauvin was assisting on the run, then he should have remained secondary and let the assigned car handle it to their discretion. Was there a procedural discrepancy with the response to the assignment? 2 policemen arrived, and shortly thereafter another 2 policemen arrived. The first 2 to arrive on the scene engaged Mr. Floyd, and he was placed in cuffs. He was subsequently seated on the sidewalk. Nothing extraneous so far as excessive physical force, except perhaps the way he was approached, could have been handled better. Next, Mr. Floyd was escorted across the street towards the store. Prior to being escorted across the street, at least one officer stated that Mr. Floyd was noticeably in distress. What actions did he take as a result of this observed distress, and when? What were the signs? If he was in fact believed to be in distress, it should have changed from a possible arrest situation into providing medical assistance. The main reason is city liability. If he were having a heart attack and was under arrest, then the city would be liable for his medical care, hospital stay, and would have to assign an officer to his room around the clock to guard him. To avoid their liability and the city's, he should have been passed off to medical personnel. He could have then been made a named suspect for future charges as well. Aside from that, it is their legal and sworn obligation to provide assistance and not to continue pursuing arrests when medical attention is needed while under their control. The policeman who first noticed the distress had the most obligation to notify the others of Mr. Floyd's suspected condition and why he thought so. Considering his suspected medical distress and only having the ability to arrest with prior authorization from the Secret Service for permission, that should have made them get him medical help and be on their way. It becomes problematic with the suspected medical complication and lack of jurisdictional authority to arrest. Once taken to the ground on his stomach alongside the squad car with his hands cuffed behind his back, he posed no threat to the 4 policemen or no threat to escape. It is nearly impossible to get up quickly or otherwise from that position or launch an assault. If it was necessary to place him prone on the ground, then there is no policy, procedure, or training that allows for any force which is no longer necessary to bring a person under control. Once unresponsive, he was unable of any resistance or threat. Minimal force required to effect an arrest is the standard to justify force, but when it is no longer necessary, there is no justification for its use or no allowance for it legally. What is the justification for kneeling on a deceased man's neck for over 2 minutes and 46 seconds after his suspected expiration? The application of the knee to the neck area is where the criminality begins and Chauvin's mental state of mind begins to be detectable and exposed. It is also at this point that the complicity of the other policemen's state of mind can be determined, regardless of if they had participated or not in the restraint. Their intent also became apparent. 2 policemen did knowingly, purposefully, willingly, and physically participate to some degree in exerting force and providing assistance to Chauvin to further his criminal excessive use of force with no legal justification. They essentially participated in the assault on Mr. Floyd since there was no legal justification for the force. The third policeman served as a deterrent and threat to discourage anyone who would intervene. With Mr. Floyd fully compromised, there was no need for any continued force or support of it. Chauvin did knowingly, willfully, purposefully, recklessly, and negligently, steadfastly hold his knee to Mr. Floyd's neck area, which resulted in his death, even if only a contributory factor. If argued that Chauvin's intent was not to kill Mr. Floyd but to restrain him, at what point did Mr. Floyd no longer need restraining? Additionally, Chauvin's excessive force was knowingly and purposely applied, resulting in Mr. Floyd's death, rendering the force intentional and the death consequential to that force. It is expected that an 18-year veteran reasonably would have known the possible consequences, especially when warned and concerns were stated by other policemen. What cannot be argued is that certainly Chauvin's knee was intentionally placed there for nearly 9 minutes duration of time, knowingly, willfully, purposely, recklessly, and negligently, without regard for the outcome, because he replied to concerns acknowledging his disregard. Chauvin's actions revealed a mindset of punishment, not restraint. With his hands in his pocket to disguise the downward force and his balancing of his full weight on Mr. Floyd's neck, fully displaying the ease of his depravity, arrogance, and control. The force used on Mr. Floyd by any officer once he was on the ground on his stomach handcuffed was a criminal act and felony assault by virtue of the policeman being armed, as well as the assault resulting in Mr. Floyd's death. Excited delirium by compression is an asphyxiation defined as suffocation or a smothering effect. Breathing restrictions and compression by weight is always the main trigger and can clearly be determined to have played a significant role in Mr. Floyd's death. As a policeman, you cannot facilitate a crime, or if you observe a crime, you are sworn to intervene, and it does not specify who is committing the crime. Any unlawful act you are sworn to intervene and prevent. There were multiple failures to intervene or pursue an alternative action which could have saved Mr. Floyd's life. At the point when Mr. Floyd was believed to have been in distress before crossing the street, at the point when he complained of breathing difficulties with Chauvin on his neck, at the point when he had no pulse when checked, at the point when an officer suggested to sit him up to avoid the known concern of death, which was the eventual outcome, at the point when a policeman explicitly mentioned excited delirium concerns, at the point when Mr. Floyd was unresponsive, and at the point when the public begged for his life were all points when and where intervention should have occurred legally. During the assault, Chauvin verbally responded, disregarding all concerns and information which he knew or should have known, being an 18-year veteran on the job, a field training officer, and the senior man on the scene. The senior man is always held to a higher standard because it is assumed he has the most experience and discernment, knowing what to do and, more importantly, what not to do. Chauvin knowingly continued his felony assault and discouraged other courses of mitigation or intervention. He knowingly and purposefully did hold his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck and maintained it there, fully aware of the risk and without legal justification. The other policemen's actions were to do nothing to end this excessive use of force and were actively complicit, holding witnesses at bay using the authority of their uniform and weapons, arguably as a criminal tool. The issue of crowd control is separate from the excessive use of force on Mr. Floyd. In no way is he responsible for the crowd which he did not incite, which reveals that a separate response regarding that concern should have been directed toward the crowd. No obstruction charges or otherwise have been levied against any member of the crowd, just as no additional force on Mr. Floyd should have been levied against Mr. Floyd for the crowd's actions. Their fear of the crowd was due to Chauvin's use of excessive force, not a menacing crowd threatening violence, but a rebuking crowd. They used their uniforms and intimidation of their authority in the furtherance of Chauvin's crime. Had it not been armed, uniformed personnel involved, there was a more likely chance a civilian would have intervened, preventing Mr. Floyd's death. They provided protection while Chauvin committed his crime, displaying their complicity and willful approval of Chauvin's actions by their inactions or support of his actions. The two rookie policemen knowingly acted to support Chauvin to further his felony physical assault, thereby consenting to his actions and sharing his mens rea, intentional infliction of unnecessary force. Their state of mind was to willfully, purposely, recklessly, and negligently, with full knowledge against all perceived risks, consent to excessive force by at one point physically assisting. It is very clear they did not oppose it or intervene to prevent it, but did assist in it. Citizens and bystanders with no time on the job or academy training knew the risk. Mr. Floyd and the public were trying to tell the policemen repeatedly. All four policemen were fully aware of their actions or inactions posed a significant risk to Mr. Floyd's life, even insinuating it themselves. The consequences of their actions or inactions were known or should have been known that serious bodily harm and or death would be the result. Due to 8 minutes and 46 seconds duration of the homicide beginning when Mr. Floyd was handcuffed on his stomach on the ground, all four policemen displayed knowing, willful, purposeful, reckless, and negligent conduct at various intervals while Mr. Floyd was the victim of excessive force that led to his death. It is obvious that Chauvin's intent was to disregard the risk of death to Mr. Floyd, continuing even when Mr. Floyd was deceased. Chauvin continued until the EMTs arrived. None of the policemen did anything to stop Chauvin or aid Mr. Floyd. All four policemen displayed each of the required mindsets during the duration of the lengthy, deadly incident at various times. This was a homicide committed by a policeman that was aided and abetted by three other policemen. Citizens' video, body cam, their own radio transmissions, and multiple witnesses in broad daylight and full view of the public were not deterrents to their crime, but is overwhelming evidence against their actions. The questions of intent or guilt for Mr. Floyd's death would seem undeniable, but due process of law and possible plea bargain or sentencing arrangements could be the only reason to claim innocence, certainly not legal justification for their actions. How could anyone defend their actions?